Hey, my name is Samantha Taylor, and for my presentation, I decided to research Yemen. I teach an adult ESL class through my church, and I have several students who have immigrated from Yemen, so I just thought this was a good opportunity to learn more about the culture there. And this is just a picture of Yemen. I'm going to start by going over a brief history of Yemen. Obviously, this is just going to cover the basics due to time because the history is just complicated and there's lots of different political struggles and regime changes and things like that. But I'm going to try to just give a brief overview of the basics. So, first, in ancient Yemen, the city was a very powerful city state, and it was a trade nation because of its production of frankincense and myrrh. Trade routes were set up where Yemen was able to easily trade with other countries. And then later, other trade routes became popular, and other countries were able to meet the demand for their the goods that they were able to trade easily, like frankincense and myrrh. And Yemen lost some of its prestige and power. By the time the Roman Empire was at its height, several centuries later, Yemen was already facing economic decline. And then later, we just were faced with political turmoil and regime changes. They had a Jewish king, and they were overthrown by a Christian king, and eventually the Persians took over. And it was a Persian governor who converted the nation to Islam in 628 and kind of set up the more modern scene of what we think of as Yemen now. By the 15th century, most people in Yemen were Sunni Muslims, and today, like 65% of Yemen are Sunni Muslim. This is a frankincense tree, and this is a myrrh tree. I just included those because I didn't actually realize that those were plants. But this is also just kind of like the countryside of Yemen also. Okay, so continuing with the history, during the age of imperialism, the British and Ottoman empires both tried to claim territory in Yemen, and then those two countries, without the Yemen people or Yemen government, brokered a deal where the Ottomans had control of the north, and then Great Britain had control of South Yemen. And I'm going to focus on the north for a second, but Yemen was able to regain control of the north in 1918, but this just started like a power struggle and people fighting to decide who is actually going to be in control of that area. There was a king for a long time in Yemen who was very determined to preserve tradition and kind of kept the area from modernizing. And then the people band together and there was a revolution and they overthrew that king in 1962, which led to more conflict and turmoil and civil war up until the time where the North and South were merged in 1990. At the same time, in the South, there was still, I'm sorry, I was on the wrong slide. So this was information about the North. This is information about the South. The South also had turmoil. They were doing better economically because they had more port cities and more access to trading. And then eventually Great Britain just withdrew in 1967. And the leaders that came into power in the South had Marxist ties and were very close to the USSR. And so their government was more in that style up until the merger in 1990. In 1990, even though North and South were technically merged, that just started a new civil war that would last until 1994. And so this is where Yemen is on the map, where it was divided into like North Yemen and South Yemen. Okay, after that civil war, there were some big changes in the government and the constitution. For example, they had Sharia law, where the law itself was heavily defined by Islam and the Quran. The economy is market-based, so people are buying and selling goods in the market. They abolished the previously held 5-member presidential council, decided that the president would be decided by universal suffrage, and they established that no one could hold office for more than 2 terms. So that all is, again, a very brief overview of some of the history and showing just some of the political turmoil that characterized that region for a long time. And so now I'm moving on to some of the cultural characteristics of people living in Yemen. So from my research, I found that like two main values of people living in Yemen would be family and then their religion. So I'm going to talk about both of those. So in Yemen, extended families typically live together in one compound, and that's just to ensure that the older generation is honored and taken care of in their old age. Society itself is patriarchal, so the oldest male in the family makes all the major decisions for the household. This includes arranging marriages for children, or not really children, but once they're older and ready to be married. Most women support their families by taking care of the house and raising their children, although rural women would definitely help by working on like family farms. And also there is nearly like a quarter of the population of women who are who obtain work outside of the home in order to support their families. So it's not that just like every woman is just in the house all the day taking care of kids. Um, Most families tend to have 3 or 4 children, although families in rural areas tend to have more kids than people living in cities. Um, and that's kind of how like family life is. It's a picture of a family in Yemen. Okay. In terms of religion, a lot of people in Yemen are proud of their religious traditions. Most are Sunni Muslims and observe daily rituals like praying 5 times a day, as well as celebrating Islamic holidays. 90%, 99% of the country is Muslim. The other 1% is a combination of like Christian, Jewish people, Hindu people, and there tends to be some discrimination towards people who are not Muslim in the area. The law of the land is in line with the Quran in a lot of ways. For example, people are not permitted to blaspheme. So that would be like to speak out against Islam or speak out against the Prophet Muhammad. And there are laws against marrying people who are not Muslim. And typically, that's not much of a problem just because so much of the population is Muslim. There's also a lot less strictness in rural areas than in city areas in terms of following the law in, as it relates to religion. Another cultural characteristic is communication expectations, which I think is just helpful to know in terms of teaching ESL to students from Yemen. People in Yemen tend to have an indirect communication style. This means they may try to hide their true meaning by saying one thing and implying another, either with like their tone of voice or body language. Directness is considered rude. People also tend to stand close together when talking because there's less of an emphasis on personal space. People also tend to interrupt each other a lot and make eye contact to show they are paying attention. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to linguistic characteristics of Arabic. Most people in Yemen speak and write in Arabic, which has lots of differences from English. Most notably, it's written and read from right to left. The alphabet is made up of 28 characteristics, and 28 characters, and those characters can be combined into over 90 elements. The characters are written slightly differently, they're shaped differently based on their position in the word. There's no upper or lowercase letters. When you're handwriting it, it's kind of similar to writing in cursive where you don't pick up your pen as you're writing. They also use something called diacritical signs, which are similar to accents, and those tell the reader how to like emphasize different sounds within a word. The language is derivational as well, which means there's always like a root word or a root character, and you add to that to create new words or to change like tense or to make something passive or active, things like that. The syntax in Arabic, or at least in classical Arabic, is typically verb, subject, object. That's not necessarily true in every dialect or even in spoken Arabic. I was reading like an article about the differences between written Arabic and spoken Arabic, and they compared it to speaking in like today's modern English and then having to force yourself to write in Shakespearean English. So knowing classical Arabic isn't necessarily the most helpful in terms of like communicating, but most of them know how to write in that way. So lastly, oh yes, and also I read that the Yemen like dialect is going to be more similar to like classical Arabic than other dialects might be. And this is a chart from the same article I was pulling information from that shows some of the different like characters and how they would be written depending on where they are in the word, as well as like how it corresponds with like English sounds. Lastly, I'm going to talk about some classroom and academic implications of teaching students from Yemen, or even just teaching students whose first language is Arabic. So first, in Arabic, each character has one sound. So some students are going to struggle with English letters that can be pronounced differently depending on the word. So it can be helpful to directly teach phonics to help students understand like how the different sounds work. Another example with phonics specifically is that some students are going to want to pronounce words that are spelled with the initial P sound. They want to pronounce it with the B sound. And I've had students in my class who struggled with that. And so the way I would try to coach them through it would be by having them put their fingers against their vocal cord so that they could feel that their vocal cords are going to buzz with the B sound and not with the P sound. And that helped them kind of work that out for themselves in the classroom. Another struggle for Arabic students in the classroom is they may be intimidated by writing. I had one student who just like the first couple of weeks in my class, like really did not want to write anything, didn't want to take notes. And this is just like a class at a church, it's not in school. So it's hard to like make a student do something they don't want to do. So convincing them of the importance of knowing how to write in English is part of the challenge. And it makes sense that it would be hard since it is directly opposite to what they're used to doing in Arabic. I've read that having students learn how to write in cursive can be helpful because it's more similar to how you write in Arabic without picking up your pen. I've also read that like just having students write without having to like be thinking of English words on their own can be helpful, like having them just copy notes or trace over letterings can help them just get used to writing in English instead of having them have to struggle through coming up with the English words and then producing that in written language. In terms of grammar, there's definitely grammar differences between English and Arabic. So one would be using, they don't always use the word to be in the present tense. So students might be tempted to say he happy instead of he is happy. And I read like one way to combat like grammar differences or any differences between English and Arabic is just by pointing out the differences, like saying to students, this is how this form works in Arabic, but this is how it works in English. So students can kind of differentiate within their head, like how to do it in one language versus the other. Pointing out those differences can help students self-correct. And then finally, we talked about some cultural differences earlier in the presentation. I think in the classroom, it's important to have conversations about culture as well, just because the best way to learn about cultural differences is by actually talking to your students and letting them share with you about your life. And that can help eliminate awkwardness when there are cultural differences. It can also help you avoid the social like faux pas where you're not trying to offend someone and they're not trying to offend you, but just cultural differences might cause a little bit of tension. I think it also just helps create that safe place within your classroom where students know that they can truly like practice language and practice communicating without fear of messing up or fear of, like putting your foot in your mouth. Yeah, and so these are my sources that I used when working on this presentation. I hope you learned something from it, and I'm looking forward to being able to learn from y'all's presentations when I go through those later. Thank you.